My first response was, you know what? I think it's a great idea if this is what you want to do, but I don't think I'm the right guy to produce it. He says, why? I says, well, I like making movies about real people, which I've done my whole career. I mean, I haven't intended to do that, but it just seems to have worked out that way. And I really like that because I like making movies about people that other people can relate to. And I don't know how to relate to a saint. So I said, I really don't know that I'm the right guy to do this. He says, no, 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 you're missing the point. This is not about her being a saint. This is an origin. You know, he didn't say this, but he said it's about a woman well, it's a woman empowerment story. He says it's not a religious story. It's not a story particularly about faith in the, capital F faith.
Sure.
It's much more about a woman who believed in herself, and as a result of her own uh, gumption and ability to stay with things, was able to make amazing things happen. I said, "Oh, I like that. That's a very that I can understand. I get that." And so from that point on, initially he didn't have a movie, he didn't have a script, he didn't have anything. He said, "Look, I'll if you want to do this with me, you can be an advisor." And that's really what I became. Initially an advisor, and I gave him ideas, and we talked about writers, and I ultimately met with Rod Barr, who Eustace actually had met, and he suggested I meet him in L.A. And he said, but if you don't want to use him, you don't have to. I just think he's a really good guy. So I met with Rod. I read some of Rod's scripts, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, this guy is very good. He's really good, and I liked the way he thought about things, and I liked his passion for the project. So I told Eustace, I said, I think he is the right guy. I said, but I don't know if he'll get us all the way there, but I think he will. He can definitely crack the story. He's the guy to do it. And I think, but in order for him to do it, I think you should make sure he goes to Italy and he really does the research. And Eustace immediately agreed with that. Took him to Europe, took him to Italy. They spent several weeks there doing research, and that was the beginning. And then when he came back, we started discussing what the movie could be. And I had read by that time a number of books about Cabrini, but and I realized that she had such an extraordinary life that you couldn't tell her story in one movie. I mean, it was just not possible that if we were going to do her longitudinal life story, this would be at least a 10-part miniseries. So, and Rod was starting to write, but it was very episodic initially because he was doing it. She was in New York, then she was in New Orleans, then she was in Nicaragua. She ultimately went to Buenos Aires, and pretty early we realized that it was getting very sketchy and episodic, and that what we really needed to do was a an origin story, which I was familiar with, even with Marshall, which was the previous movie I had done about Thurgood Marshall. That was an origin story too. It wasn't about him being the, the justice of the Supreme Court. It was about him as a young lawyer. So we figured, okay, if we tell the story of her from her beginnings somewhat and bring her through New York, which was the first place she came to, that would be enough. That would be the canvas on which we would tell the story. And that became the process because it made sense that everything that she did in New York was the model for what she did after she left New York. She went from New York to Buffalo. She was in Chicago major time. She was in New Orleans. She was in Los Angeles. She did go to South America. She went to all these other places, but she was creating the model in New York and then defining the model afterwards.
Did
So,
you have people though who said to you, "Oh yeah, that it's not going to work," because
well,
you'd have people in your business where they go, "Yeah, no, they're not going to be watching a religious person."
of course, everybody did, and one of the big things we were concerned about was, is this just going to be perceived as a religious movie about a nun? Who wants to go see a movie about a nun anyway? So, I mean, that was and we said, well, we have to find a way to separate ourselves from that in some way. We have to find a way to define her as she's a woman first. She happened to be a nun, but that it wasn't the driving. I mean, what made her interesting was what she was made of, not what she became, in terms of religious order. So we didn't really want to go into that in the story. Now, it's still an issue in terms of marketing because it's very hard to separate yourself from, when you have someone who's in a habit and she's always dressed that way, you're going to think that way. And it's still a challenge in the marketing to figure out quite how to do that. But that's the challenge we're facing. But we're doing fairly well. I mean, I'm pretty happy about the way we're doing, and I certainly was never interested in doing a kind of a typical faith-based story. That was not what this is, and it isn't. I mean, anyone who sees the movie, and this is really where I think movies survive, is the word of mouth, and the word of mouth is not going to be about a woman who prays for things to happen, and that's the way it happened. No, she's a woman who actually goes out and finds a way to make things happen herself, and that's what makes her interesting and unusual.